Welcome. Tonight's story takes us back to a quieter world. The age of dinosaurs, near its end. We follow an old Tyrannosaurus rex, scarred by time, as it faces rivals, fading strength, and a changing land. What begins as a search for food becomes a final journey toward rest, fossilization, and deep time. Let it carry you gently into sleep.
68 million years ago, the Earth trembles beneath footsteps that will never come again. In the coastal plains of what will one day be Montana, where rivers wind through forests of towering conifers and cycads, the final chapter of the age of dinosaurs is being written in tooth and bone. Here, in the lush wetlands of Laramidia, separated from eastern North America by a vast inland sea, the most formidable predator that ever walked the earth claims dominion over a world on the edge of oblivion. The morning mist rises from the Hell Creek floodplains as a massive shadow moves through the dawn. 13 meters from snout to tail tip, weighing nearly 9 tons, this Tyrannosaurus rex embodies evolutionary perfection honed across millions of years. But perfection, like everything else in this ancient world, carries the seeds of its own ending. Deep scars cross the giant's massive skull, puncture wounds that have healed into ridged bone, testament to battles fought and survived. Each mark tells a story of dominance challenged and maintained, of a crown earned through violence in a realm where only the strongest claim the right to kill. This is no ordinary morning. The Tyrannosaur's great head lifts, nostrils flaring as chemical messages flood its extraordinary olfactory system. The scent trails paint an invisible map of the wetland ecosystem, the musky signatures of Edmontosaurus herds grazing in distant meadows, the sharper tang of Triceratops moving through woodland clearings, and beneath it all, the metallic sweetness of blood. Something has died in the night, and in a world where 9 tons of predator must feed regularly to survive, death is opportunity. The beast moves with surprising grace for something so massive, each stride covering 4 meters of muddy ground. Its barrel-shaped body, supported by legs like living tree trunks, cuts through the morning shadows with the confidence of absolute supremacy. For over 2 decades, this individual has ruled these waterways and forests, its bone-crushing jaws the final arbiters in countless struggles for survival. But time, the one predator that cannot be fought, has begun to extract its toll. The Tyrannosaur's left hind limb carries a slight stiffness, an old injury from a territorial dispute 5 years past, when a younger rival dared to challenge for hunting grounds along the river bend. The battle had been brief but brutal, ending when the veteran's jaws had found purchase on the challenger's neck, 35,000 newtons of pressure ending the contest with a wet crack that echoed across the wetlands. The defeated rival had fled, bearing wounds that would forever mark it as subordinate, while the victor had claimed the prize of continued dominance. But victory had come at a cost, torn ligaments and damaged cartilage that now announced themselves with each step on this cooling morning. The scent trail grows stronger, leading the great predator toward a grove of towering metasequoia trees, where the canopy filters the strengthening sunlight into cathedral columns of gold and green. Here, where the river has carved a natural amphitheater in the landscape, lies the source of that tantalizing aroma. A juvenile Edmontosaurus, perhaps 3 meters long, lies motionless among the cycad fronds, Its duck-like bill is twisted at an unnatural angle, neck broken. Whether by accident or the hunt of a smaller predator matters little now. What matters is that 800 kilograms of fresh meat await claiming, and in the unforgiving arithmetic of apex predation, such windfalls are never ignored. But the Tyrannosaur is not alone in recognizing opportunity. As it approaches the carcass, another massive form emerges from the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing. Another Tyrannosaurus rex, younger, unmarked by the accumulated battles of decades, but nearly as large and hungry with the endless appetite of its kind. The two giants regard each other across the still form of their potential meal, and in that moment of recognition, the ancient protocols of their species assert themselves. The elder Tyrannosaur raises its massive skull and releases a sound that has no modern equivalent, a bone-deep rumble that seems to originate from the very foundations of the earth. The vocalization carries across the wetlands at frequencies that penetrate flesh and resonate in the chest cavities of every creature within kilometers. It is a declaration and a warning combined. This territory, this kill, this moment belongs to the scarred veteran who has earned the right through 2 decades of successful predation. The younger challenger responds in kind, its own bellowing call rising to meet the veteran's claim. Where the elder's voice carries the authority of experience, the challenger's holds the fierce vitality of youth unmarked by compromise. The two sounds clash in the morning air like the prelude to storm, sending smaller dinosaurs fleeing through the undergrowth and causing even the great herbivores in distant meadows to lift their heads in wary recognition of nearby death. What follows is a display as old as their lineage, the ritualized confrontation between apex predators who share neither territory nor tolerance for competition. The elder moves first, striding forward with calculated aggression, its skull lowered to showcase the impressive array of teeth that have crushed countless bones in service of survival. Each tooth, in its massive jaws, tells a story of successful predation. The banana-sized premaxillary incisors designed for gripping and holding struggling prey, the blade-like maxillary teeth that slice through hide and muscle, and the bone-crushing posterior teeth that can pulverize the femur of a triceratops. The younger Tyrannosaur mirrors the display, its own impressive dental arsenal gleaming in the filtered sunlight. But where the veteran's teeth show the wear patterns of thousands of successful kills, edges slightly dulled by contact with bone, surfaces polished by the passage of flesh, the challengers remain sharp and pristine, evidence of inexperience rather than failure. This distinction, invisible to all but the most careful observer, may prove decisive in what is to come. The standoff continues for long minutes, each predator seeking advantage through positioning and intimidation. The veteran circles slowly, using its superior knowledge of the terrain to place itself between the challenger and the deepest part of the river, where retreat would mean potential drowning should the confrontation turn violent. The younger Tyrannosaur, perhaps recognizing this tactical disadvantage, begins to back away from the carcass, but its retreat is measured and deliberate rather than panicked, the withdrawal of calculated prudence rather than defeated cowardice. In the complex social dynamics of apex predators, this moment represents a negotiation written in threat display and spatial positioning. The veteran's claim is clear, but not absolute. The challenger's concession is tactical rather than permanent. Neither animal can afford the injuries that would result from actual combat, for in a world where survival depends on the ability to hunt successfully, even minor wounds can prove fatal over time. The younger Tyrannosaur retreats to a respectful distance and settles into a crouch among the ferns, close enough to claim scraps should any remain after the veteran has fed, but far enough to avoid triggering an escalation to violence. With dominance temporarily established, the elder Tyrannosaur approaches its prize. The mechanics of feeding reveal adaptations honed across millions of years of predatory evolution. Its massive jaws, powered by muscles that comprise nearly 10% of its total body mass, descend toward the carcass with surgical precision. The first bite targets the soft tissue of the hadrosaur's flank, teeth sliding through skin and muscle, with an efficiency that belies their crushing power. But it is the second bite that demonstrates the true uniqueness of tyrannosaur feeding behavior. Where other large theropods might content themselves with flesh alone, the Tyrannosaurus rex attacks the very bones of its prey. The sound that follows, a wet crunch that echoes across the wetlands, announces the deployment of the most powerful bite force in terrestrial animal history. 35,000 newtons of pressure, equivalent to the weight of a small truck concentrated at the tips of serrated teeth, reduces the hadrosaur's ribcage to splinters. This is osteophagy in its most extreme form, the systematic consumption of bone to access the rich marrow within, a feeding strategy that extracts every possible calorie from each kill and enables these massive predators to maintain their enormous bulk. As the veteran feeds, evidence of its accumulated years becomes increasingly apparent. The slight tremor in its left foreleg, barely noticeable during normal locomotion, becomes more pronounced as the animal shifts position around the carcass. The small but powerful arms, each ending in vicious claws, show greater wear on the right than the left, compensation for some long-ago injury that has subtly altered the tyrannosaur's balance. These are not weaknesses in any conventional sense, but rather the inevitable accumulations of a successful predatory career, each mark and modification a testament to survival in an unforgiving world. The feeding continues with methodical thoroughness. Each bite is calculated to maximize nutritional return while minimizing energy expenditure. The unconscious economics of apex predation played out in real time. The tyrannosaur's keen eyesight, several times sharper than that of modern humans, guides the precise placement of each attack on the carcass. Its extraordinary sense of smell continues to monitor the surrounding environment even as it feeds, ready to detect the approach of additional competitors or the shifting chemical signatures that might indicate changes in weather or prey movement patterns. But the late Cretaceous world is not a stable one. As the morning progresses toward midday, subtle changes in the environment begin to register on the tyrannosaur's sensitive perception systems. The quality of light filtering through the canopy takes on a peculiar cast, not the golden warmth of normal sunshine, but something hazier, more diffuse. A thin layer of ash, nearly invisible to creatures without the tyrannosaur's visual acuity, has begun to settle on the leaves of the metasequoia trees. The chemical composition of the air itself carries unfamiliar signatures, metallic and sharp, that speak of disturbances far beyond the normal rhythms of seasonal change. These are the early warning signs of the catastrophic events that will, in mere hundreds of thousands of years, bring an end to the age of dinosaurs. Increased volcanic activity along the western margins of Laramidia has begun to pump ash and sulfur compounds into the atmosphere, creating the subtle environmental stresses that will make ecosystems vulnerable to the final asteroid-driven collapse. But evolution has not prepared even the most successful predators to recognize or respond to threats on geological timescales. The Tyrannosaur continues its meal, unaware that it feeds in the twilight of its kind's dominion over the Earth. The younger challenger, still maintaining its respectful distance, has begun to show signs of increasing agitation. The scent of fresh meat and flowing blood triggers feeding responses that become more difficult to suppress as time passes. Its own hunger, deferred but not forgotten, drives a restless pacing that carries it in gradually tightening circles around the feeding site. The veteran, alert to these subtle changes in behavior, periodically lifts its massive head to fix the younger animal with a warning stare, blood dripping from jaws that remain ready to defend their claim. This secondary tension adds another layer of complexity to an already charged situation. The protocols of Tyrannosaur social interaction include provisions for subordinate feeding. Scraps and remainders left by dominant individuals can be claimed by those lower in the hierarchy without triggering aggressive responses. But the timing and manner of such scavenging must be precisely judged. Too early an approach will be seen as challenge. Too late, and nothing may remain of a carcass that represents the difference between survival and starvation. The balance shifts when the veteran's feeding is interrupted by a new scent signature carried on the morning breeze. Something large approaches through the forest, not the familiar musk of hadrosaur or ceratopsian, but the distinctive chemical signature of another apex predator. A third tyrannosaur, drawn by the same olfactory beacon that attracted the first challenger, moves through the trees with the confident stride of an animal that has never learned to fear competition. The veteran lifts its blood-stained muzzle and tests the air more carefully, reading the approaching signature with the expertise of decades. This is a problem of an entirely different magnitude. Two tyrannosaurs sharing proximity to a single carcass represents a manageable tension, resolved through established dominance protocols. Three predators of such size and capability create a dynamic with no stable resolution. The approaching animal's scent signature suggests full maturity and excellent health. Neither the deference of youth nor the accumulated damage markers that might indicate easy subordination. The veteran's scarred features contract in what might be recognized as concentration, the processing of tactical information that will determine how the next few minutes unfold. The younger challenger has also detected the approaching presence, and its behavioral patterns shift immediately from restless patience to active alertness. The possibility of claiming feeding rights has suddenly become vastly more complex, but also potentially more promising. In a three-way confrontation, alliances become possible, and even a subordinate animal might find opportunities that would never exist in simple bilateral competition. The challenger begins to move more deliberately, positioning itself to take advantage of whatever chaos might follow. The third tyrannosaur emerges from the tree line with dramatic effect, its massive form seeming to materialize from the shadows like some primordial manifestation of predatory power. This individual shows none of the accumulated damage that marks the veteran. No healed bite wounds on its skull, no subtle irregularities in gait or posture. Its hide carries the unmarked perfection of an animal in its prime, every aspect of its anatomy, testament to successful adaptation and inherited strength. When it vocalizes its presence, the sound carries a quality of assured dominance that has never been successfully challenged. The three giants regard each other in a moment of perfect tension, each massive predator, calculating odds and opportunities with the cold precision that evolution has honed in their neural architecture. The carcass that began this confrontation now seems almost insignificant beside the larger question of territorial dominance and feeding hierarchy that must be resolved before any of them can claim their meal. The veteran, despite its accumulated experience, recognizes that its position has become critically compromised. Two younger, healthier rivals present a mathematical problem that cannot be solved through intimidation alone. What follows is a display of Tyrannosaur social behavior, rarely preserved in the fossil record, but clearly evident in the battle-scarred skulls that paleontologists have recovered from Hell Creek deposits. The veteran begins what can only be described as a fighting withdrawal, backing slowly away from the carcass while maintaining eye contact with both rivals. Its movements remain controlled and dignified, not the panicked flight of defeated prey, but the calculated retreat of an experienced predator, choosing discretion over unnecessary risk. The two younger tyrannosaurs watch this withdrawal with predatory intensity, but neither moves immediately to pursue. The complex etiquette of apex-predator interaction includes recognition that a retreating dominant animal still poses considerable danger, particularly if pressed into a corner where retreat becomes impossible. The veteran's withdrawal continues until it reaches the edge of the clearing, where the dense growth of tree ferns provides visual concealment while maintaining acoustic contact with the feeding site. From this position of tactical security, the veteran settles into a crouch and begins its own waiting game. The two remaining tyrannosaurs now face each other across the hadrosaur carcass, their own dominance hierarchy still to be determined. The newcomer's size advantage is slight but noticeable, and its unmarked condition suggests either superior fighting ability or insufficient experience to have faced serious challenges. The original challenger, intermediate in both size and experience, finds itself in the unenviable position of being neither clearly dominant nor obviously subordinate. The standoff that develops between these two reveals subtle complexities in tyrannosaur behavior that speak to sophisticated social cognition. Rather than immediately escalating to physical confrontation, both animals begin a series of testing behaviors, sudden movements toward the carcass followed by immediate withdrawal, vocalizations that probe for responses without fully committing to challenge, positioning changes that test the other's reactions without triggering actual aggression. This behavioral chess match demonstrates intelligence and social awareness far beyond simple reptilian reflexes. The veteran, observing from its concealed position, watches this display with what might be recognized as professional interest. Its own feeding has been interrupted, but the tactical knowledge gained from observing how these younger animals interact may prove valuable in future encounters. The accumulated wisdom of successful survival includes understanding not just how to fight, but when fighting can be avoided, and how rivals assess each other's capabilities. This impromptu lesson in tyrannosaur social dynamics provides information that could influence territorial negotiations for months to come. The resolution, when it comes, demonstrates the pragmatic flexibility that enabled tyrannosaurs to dominate their ecosystems for millions of years. Rather than engaging in potentially costly combat over a carcass that can adequately feed only one animal, the two younger tyrannosaurs begin to implement a sharing arrangement based on precise behavioral protocols. The larger newcomer claims primary feeding rights, approaching the hadrosaur with confident authority, while the original challenger accepts secondary status but maintains proximity to claim eventual scavenging opportunities. This arrangement transforms the competitive dynamic into something approaching cooperation, with both animals benefiting from reduced risk of injury while ensuring that neither leaves the encounter entirely empty-handed. The veteran, still watching from concealment, recognizes the stability of this resolution and begins its own patient wait for whatever scraps might eventually become available. In the harsh arithmetic of late Cretaceous survival, even the most successful predators must occasionally accept reduced portions rather than risk the injuries that could compromise future hunting success. As the primary feeder begins its systematic dismantling of the carcass, the sounds of bone-crushing osteophagy once again echo across the wetlands. But now these sounds carry additional significance, marking not just successful predation, but successful social negotiation. The complex behavioral adaptations that allowed multiple apex predators to coexist in the same ecosystem without driving each other to extinction through endless competition. The feeding continues with methodical efficiency, each bite precisely calculated to maximize nutritional extraction, while the other animals wait their turns with predatory patience. The afternoon progresses with the slow rhythms of ancient time, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the gradual consumption of 800 kilograms of meat and bone. The ash that began settling on the forest canopy with the morning light has thickened almost imperceptibly, creating a haze that filters the sunlight and lends an otherworldly quality to the scene. Chemical signatures in the air continue to carry the metallic sharpness that speaks of geological upheaval, but these warnings remain beyond the interpretive capacity of even the most successful predators evolution has yet produced. When the primary feeder finally withdraws, satiated and heavy with consumed flesh, nearly half the carcass has been systematically processed through the most powerful jaws in Earth's history. The secondary feeder approaches with careful respect for established protocols, its own feeding methodology revealing subtle differences in technique and preference. Where the first animal focused primarily on the richest organs and marrow-heavy bones, the second demonstrates more thorough processing of available muscle tissue, extracting nutrition from parts the primary feeder deemed insufficient for its energy expenditure. The veteran's turn comes last, when only scattered remains mark the site where a thriving young hadrosaur had fallen hours earlier. But even these scraps represent significant nutritional value to an animal capable of crushing and digesting bone, and the veteran approaches its meal with the same systematic thoroughness that has characterized its decades of successful predation. Each fragment is carefully evaluated and precisely processed, demonstrating the efficiency that enabled tyrannosaurs to maintain their enormous bulk in ecosystems that might seem incapable of supporting such massive predators. As the feeding concludes and the three tyrannosaurs begin to disperse, The complex social dynamics that brought them together resolve into temporary equilibrium. The territorial boundaries that govern their normal activities reassert themselves, with each animal returning to its established hunting grounds and preferred habitats. But the encounter has created subtle changes in their mutual awareness and recognition that will influence future interactions throughout their ranges. Knowledge of rivals' capabilities, behavioral patterns, and territorial preferences becomes part of the accumulated wisdom that guides survival decisions in a world where miscalculation can prove fatal. The veteran returns to its favored hunting grounds along the river bend, where the slow current creates oxbow lakes, perfect for ambush predation. But the slight stiffness in its left hind limb has worsened during the prolonged confrontation, and the energy expenditures of dominance display and defensive positioning have depleted reserves that would normally sustain hunting activities for days. The successful feeding has addressed immediate nutritional needs, but the underlying challenge remains. An aging predator in a world that offers no retirement from the constant demands of survival. Over the following days, as the ashfall continues and the chemical composition of the atmosphere shifts in ways too subtle for contemporary detection, but profound enough to stress ecosystems across the continent, the veteran's hunting success begins to decline. Prey animals that once seemed easily accessible now require energy expenditures that approach the limits of sustainable effort. The Edmontosaurus herds have become more wary, their sentries more alert to the ground vibrations that announce approaching tyrannosaurs. Even the juveniles that once provided reliable prey now seem faster, more elusive, as if some collective awareness of increased predation pressure has heightened their survival responses. The cumulative effect of these small changes creates a cascade of challenges that test the veteran's accumulated survival skills. Hunting failures that once occurred rarely now happen with increasing frequency, forcing longer periods between successful kills and creating the constant specter of starvation that haunts all apex predators. The Tyrannosaur's extraordinary sense of smell becomes increasingly focused on detecting carrion rather than tracking live prey, a subtle shift in behavior that marks the transition from primary predator to opportunistic scavenger. But opportunity, in the form of another carcass discovered along a distant riverbank, provides temporary reprieve from these mounting pressures. A massive Triceratops, perhaps weighing 6 tons in life, lies partially submerged in the muddy shallows where floodwaters have receded. The 3-horned giant's death appears recent, its body showing no signs of scavenging, despite the rich banquet it represents. This is a prize worthy of significant risk, offering enough nutrition to sustain even a tyrannosaur for weeks. The veteran approaches this discovery with heightened caution, born of hard-earned experience. Triceratops, even in death, command respect from even the most formidable predators. Their massive skulls, protected by bone frills that can exceed 2 meters in width, house brains capable of sophisticated defensive behavior even in extremis. The 3 facial horns, each over 1 meter in length and sharp as spear points, can inflict fatal wounds on attacking tyrannosaurs even during the death throes of their owners. Fossil evidence from Hell Creek formations includes tyrannosaur bones bearing the distinctive puncture wounds that could only have been inflicted by ceratopsian horns, testament to the deadly effectiveness of these herbivorous weapons. Initial investigation reveals the cause of the Triceratops's demise: a massive bite wound on its left flank, too large and deep to have been inflicted by any predator other than another tyrannosaur. The edges of the wound show the distinctive crushing pattern of a bite force exceeding 30,000 newtons, applied with the surgical precision that marks the hunting technique of an experienced adult. But something went wrong during the attack. The Triceratops's right horn bears blood traces and tissue fragments that could only have come from its attacker, suggesting a counterattack that successfully wounded the Tyrannosaur and perhaps drove it away from its kill. This discovery presents the veteran with a complex tactical problem. The carcass represents perhaps the richest feeding opportunity available in its territory, but the circumstances of the Triceratops's death suggest that another tyrannosaur, possibly wounded and therefore unpredictably dangerous, may still claim ownership. The scent signatures around the kill site tell a story of violence and desperation, with chemical markers indicating stress hormones and adrenaline that speak of a life or death struggle between titans. The decision to approach requires careful assessment of risks and benefits that reach beyond immediate nutritional needs. A wounded tyrannosaur defending a kill represents perhaps the most dangerous situation an apex predator can encounter. Pain and hunger can drive even successful predators to take risks they would normally avoid, and a cornered animal fighting for its life possesses a ferocity that transcends normal competitive behaviors. But the veteran's own declining condition leaves little choice. This opportunity may represent the difference between continued survival and the slow starvation that claims apex predators when their hunting abilities begin to fail. The approach is executed with all the stealth and tactical awareness that decades of successful predation have developed. Each step is placed with careful attention to ground conditions that might create noise or leave tracks, while constant monitoring of wind direction ensures that scent signatures remain concealed from potential rivals. The veteran's extraordinary sensory capabilities map the kill site in precise detail. The exact positioning of the carcass, the depth of water surrounding it, the sight lines and approach routes that offer tactical advantages, and most critically, the scent trails that might reveal the presence and condition of the original attacker. What those scent trails reveal proves both encouraging and troubling. The tyrannosaur that killed the Triceratops was indeed wounded during the attack. Blood traces mixed with its chemical signature tell a story of significant injury, possibly to the facial region, where ceratopsian horns could inflict maximum damage. But the trail also indicates that the wounded animal withdrew from the kill site only hours earlier, meaning it could return at any moment to reclaim its prize. The veteran finds itself in the position of claiming another predator's kill, a behavior that violates the territorial protocols that normally prevent tyrannosaurs from destroying each other through endless conflict. The feeding begins with heightened alertness, every bite interrupted by careful monitoring of the surrounding environment. The Triceratops's massive bulk requires systematic dismantling, with the veteran's bone-crushing jaws working methodically through the herbivore's formidable defenses. The skull frill, despite its intimidating appearance, yields to tyrannosaur teeth designed specifically for penetrating the thickest armor that late Cretaceous evolution could devise. Each successful bite releases rich marrow and organ meat that flows through the veteran's system like liquid energy, restoring reserves depleted by weeks of marginal nutrition. But this restoration comes at a price measured in constant vigilance and growing tension. The chemical signatures carried on the afternoon wind tell of an approaching storm system that will complicate both feeding and potential escape routes. More immediately threatening, the scent trails of the wounded Tyrannosaur show signs of recent refreshing. The animal is moving through its territory in patterns that suggest it may be returning to check on its abandoned kill. The veteran's feeding must balance nutritional needs against the increasing probability of violent confrontation with a desperate rival. The confrontation, when it comes, unfolds with the terrible inevitability of colliding forces too massive to deflect or avoid. The wounded Tyrannosaur emerges from the forest shadows like vengeance incarnate, its massive skull bearing the fresh gouges where a Triceratops' horn found its mark above the left eye socket. The wound has sealed but not healed, creating a grotesque modification of features that would normally command respect through their unmarked perfection. Blood traces still darken the serrated edges of teeth, revealed in a threat display that needs no interpretation. This animal has come to reclaim what it considers rightfully its own. The veteran's response demonstrates the complex psychology of apex predator confrontation. Rather than immediately abandoning the carcass, it adopts a defensive feeding position that protects access to the richest portions while maintaining readiness for either escalation or withdrawal. This is not the behavior of a subordinate animal yielding to superior force, but rather the calculated response of an experienced predator weighing tactical options in a situation where simple dominance displays may prove insufficient. What follows challenges every assumption about Tyrannosaur social behavior and the limits of intraspecific competition. The wounded animal's approach carries none of the ritualized threat displays that normally precede predator confrontations. Instead, its movements show the focused intensity of an animal pushed beyond the normal boundaries of competitive behavior into genuine desperation. The combination of significant injury, lost feeding opportunity, and territorial violation has created a psychological state that transcends normal social protocols and approaches genuine berserker fury. The veteran recognizes this shift in behavioral patterns and responds accordingly, abandoning the carcass and beginning a tactical withdrawal toward deeper water, where the wounded animal's obvious facial injuries might affect depth perception and balance. But the wounded Tyrannosaur's pursuit continues with relentless determination, its vocalizations carrying overtones of pain and rage that speak to suffering beyond simple competitive frustration. This is no longer a dispute over feeding rights, but something approaching genuine hatred between apex predators pushed beyond the limits of coexistence. The battle, when it finally erupts, reveals Tyrannosaur combat capabilities that fossil evidence can only hint at through healed wounds and bite-marked bones. The wounded animal's charge covers the distance between rivals in seconds, its massive jaws targeting the veteran's neck with lethal precision. But experience and tactical positioning prove their worth. The veteran's counterattack finds its mark on the attacker's already damaged skull, opening wounds that release fresh flows of blood into the muddy water. The sound of the impact echoes across the wetlands like thunder, a bone-deep crash that sends every creature within kilometers fleeing in primitive terror. 35,000 newtons of bite force meets 35,000 newtons in a collision that represents the ultimate expression of terrestrial predatory power. Both animals stagger under the mutual impact, their massive forms churning the shallow water into bloody foam as each seeks the throat hold that will end the confrontation permanently. But this battle between titans reveals the terrible cost of apex predator competition. The wounded animal's injuries, aggravated by combat stress and fresh trauma, begin to affect its coordination and fighting ability. Blood loss from reopened wounds creates a spreading crimson cloud in the shallow water, while the veteran's own accumulated damage, the old leg injury, the healing bite marks, the simple attrition of accumulated age, begins to compromise its ability to maintain defensive positioning. The resolution comes not through decisive victory, but through mutual recognition of potential mutual destruction. As both animals pause in their deadly embrace, blood flowing from fresh wounds and older injuries alike, some deeper survival instinct asserts itself over territorial fury. The wounded animal's retreat is neither dignified nor entirely voluntary. Blood loss and exhaustion have combined to make continued fighting potentially suicidal. But the veteran's victory is equally pyrrhic, its own injuries aggravated, and its energy reserves depleted beyond easy recovery. In the aftermath of this confrontation, both tyrannosaurs face the harsh reality that apex predator status offers no protection from the ultimate consequences of competitive pressure. The wounded animal disappears into the forest depths, following scent trails toward distant territories where it might find easier prey, or simply a place to heal or die in peace. The veteran remains with its hard-won prize, but the cost of claiming it has potentially exceeded the nutritional benefit, creating a deadly spiral of diminishing returns that threatens to end its decades of successful predation. The feeding that follows this victory carries a desperate quality absent from earlier meals. Each bite must maximize nutritional extraction while the veteran's depleted condition allows, for there can be no guarantee of future opportunities. The Triceratops carcass, despite its massive size, begins to seem insufficient beside the energy expenditures required to claim and defend it. The mathematics of apex predation, usually hidden beneath the overwhelming success that marks dominant predators, now reveal themselves in stark and unforgiving detail. As evening approaches and the storm clouds that have been building throughout the day finally release their burden, the veteran finds itself feeding in a downpour that transforms the kill site into a muddy chaos of flowing water and churned sediment. The rain brings both blessing and curse, washing away the scent signatures that might attract additional competition, while simultaneously threatening to sweep away the carcass itself if the shallow river continues to rise. The veteran's feeding becomes a race against time and weather, each swallowed mouthful potentially the last, before circumstances force abandonment of this hard-won prize. The storm intensifies with the darkness, bringing winds that drive ash-laden rain horizontally across the landscape, and lightning that illuminates the feeding tyrannosaur in stroboscopic glimpses of primordial ferocity. But this is no ordinary late Cretaceous weather system. The ash content in the rainfall exceeds anything in the normal climatic patterns of Laramidia, carrying chemical signatures that speak of volcanic upheaval on continental scales. The metallic taste that floods the veteran's sensory system with each swallowed bite represents more than simple mineral content. It is the flavor of planetary catastrophe, the first course in a meal that will ultimately consume entire ecosystems. By dawn, the storm has passed but left a landscape transformed. The river has risen 3 meters during the night, submerging the kill site and forcing the veteran to higher ground, where the morning light reveals a world dusted with volcanic ash that turns every surface into a canvas of gray desolation. The Triceratops' carcass has been swept away by the floodwaters, leaving only scattered bone fragments embedded in the muddy banks to mark where the night's feeding occurred. The veteran stands amid this alien landscape, its massive form somehow diminished by the scale of environmental change occurring around it. The ashfall that began as an almost imperceptible dusting has thickened into a coating that dulls colors and muffles sounds, transforming the familiar wetland ecosystem into something strange and threatening. Plants struggle under the weight of accumulated particles, their photosynthetic processes gradually being impaired by the reduction in available sunlight. The complex web of relationships that sustain the Hell Creek ecosystem faces disruption on a scale that will test every species' adaptive capabilities to their limits. For the veteran Tyrannosaur, these environmental changes represent challenges that extend far beyond simple hunting difficulties. Its extraordinary olfactory capabilities, evolved to detect chemical signatures across vast distances, now must contend with atmospheric conditions that alter and mask the scent trails essential for successful predation. The dust that settles on every surface creates a uniform gray blanket that disrupts the visual landmarks used for territorial navigation, while the reduced sunlight affects the behavior patterns of prey species in ways that require constant adaptation of hunting strategies. The morning hunt demonstrates these new realities with brutal clarity. An Edmontosaurus herd that would normally be grazing in predictable patterns along the river meadows has instead gathered in dense, defensive formations, their usual dispersed feeding replaced by tight clustering that makes individual predation nearly impossible. The hadrosaur's acute awareness of environmental stress has triggered behavioral responses that prioritize collective security over feeding efficiency, creating tactical challenges that the veteran's accumulated hunting experience has never encountered. The stalking approach that once guaranteed successful kills now proves inadequate against prey that maintains constant vigilance and refuses to separate from protective group formations. The veteran's attempts to isolate vulnerable individuals result only in frustrated circling around alert herds that track every movement with collective awareness. Hours of energy expenditure yield nothing but the growing realization that familiar hunting strategies may no longer suffice in this transformed world. By midday, as the ash continues to fall and the environmental stress becomes increasingly apparent, the veteran makes a decision that reflects both tactical flexibility and the deepening desperation of its situation. Rather than continuing to pursue increasingly elusive live prey, it begins to follow scent trails toward older kills and natural deaths that might provide scavenging opportunities. This represents a fundamental shift in predatory behavior, the transition from apex hunter to opportunistic scavenger that marks the beginning of the end for apex predators when environmental conditions exceed their adaptive capabilities. The search for carrion leads through a landscape increasingly dominated by ash and the subtle signs of ecosystem collapse. Dead fish float in the backwaters, where acid rain has altered water chemistry beyond the tolerance of native species. Smaller dinosaurs huddle in whatever shelter they can find, their normal activity patterns disrupted by the constant irritation of airborne particles and the reduced visibility that hampers both predator avoidance and prey detection. The complex behavioral patterns that normally govern late Cretaceous ecosystem interactions begin to break down as each species focuses on individual survival rather than the intricate relationships that maintain community stability. The discovery, when it comes, represents both salvation and a glimpse of the broader catastrophe unfolding across Laramidia. In a grove of dying conifers, their needles brown and falling under the weight of accumulated ash, the veteran finds what may be its final meal. 3 juvenile tyrannosaurs lie motionless among the fallen branches, not the result of territorial combat or predatory attack, but victims of the changing atmospheric conditions that have begun to stress respiratory systems evolved for cleaner air. The smallest of the 3, perhaps 2 years old and already 3 meters in length, shows clear signs of respiratory distress in its final moments. Its jaws hang open in what must have been a desperate attempt to process oxygen from increasingly toxic air, while mucus discharge around its nostrils tells of immune system failure in the face of volcanic particulates that evolution never anticipated. This is not the dramatic death of predatory violence, but the quiet suffocation of environmental catastrophe, a preview of the mass extinction that will claim entire lineages within geological moments. The veteran approaches this grim bounty with instincts that recognize opportunity, while senses detect the wrongness that permeates the scene. The chemical signatures surrounding the dead juveniles carry markers of systemic toxicity that speak to poisoning on a cellular level. These are not healthy carcasses killed by accident or predation, but poisoned meat that may carry its own dangers for any scavenger desperate enough to consume it. Yet hunger and the failure of normal hunting strategies leave few alternatives for an aging predator in a world where familiar rules no longer apply. The feeding begins with cautious testing, small bites that allow evaluation of taste and immediate physiological response before committing to larger consumption. The meat carries the metallic tang that has become omnipresent in the ash-laden environment, but deeper analysis reveals no immediate toxicity beyond the general contamination affecting all organic matter in this transformed landscape. The veteran's powerful digestive system evolved to process everything from delicate organ meat to pulverized bone, proves capable of handling the chemical burden, at least in the short term. As the feeding progresses, the full scope of the environmental disaster becomes increasingly apparent. The ashfall has intensified throughout the day, creating a gray twilight that transforms noon into something resembling dusk. Visibility has dropped to mere dozens of meters, forcing all creatures to rely increasingly on non-visual senses that may themselves be compromised by airborne contaminants. The veteran's extraordinary olfactory capabilities, normally capable of detecting prey across kilometers, now struggle to process chemical signatures through the particulate haze that fills every breath. But it is the silence that proves most unsettling. The normal acoustic landscape of late Cretaceous life, the calls of hadrosaurs, the rustling of smaller dinosaurs through undergrowth, the splash of pterosaurs fishing in distant waters, has been replaced by an unnatural quiet, broken only by the soft whisper of falling ash and the occasional crack of branches breaking under accumulated weight. This is the sound of an ecosystem in collapse, its complex web of interactions severing as species retreat into desperate survival mode. The veteran completes its scavenging as the afternoon light dims further, its massive form moving through the ash-laden air like a ghost of prehistoric power. The nutritional value of the 3 juvenile carcasses has restored immediate energy reserves, but the psychological impact of feeding on its own kind, even juveniles that died from environmental causes rather than predatory action, represents a crossing of behavioral boundaries that speaks to the desperate circumstances driving all surviving creatures. As evening approaches, the veteran seeks shelter in a cave system carved by ancient waters into the limestone bluffs that overlook the river valley. These caves have provided refuge during previous storms and seasonal floods, but tonight they offer protection from an environmental assault unlike anything in the evolutionary memory of Tyrannosaur lineage. The massive predator settles into the largest chamber, its form barely fitting in a space that once seemed more than adequate for temporary shelter. From this rocky sanctuary, the veteran watches the final collapse of the world it has dominated for over 2 decades. The ashfall continues through the night, accumulating in drifts that begin to bury the familiar landmarks of its territory. Trees that have stood for decades succumb to the weight and toxicity of volcanic debris, their massive trunks crashing to earth with impacts that shake the cave walls. The river itself has changed color, its waters now carrying a gray burden that transforms the life-giving waterway into something alien and threatening. The dawn that follows brings no relief from the environmental catastrophe, only a continuation of conditions that make survival increasingly impossible for creatures evolved during stable climatic periods. The ash has accumulated to depths that impede movement even for an animal of the veteran's size and power, while the continued reduction in air quality makes each breath a struggle. The world outside the cave has become a gray wasteland where familiar shapes emerge and disappear in the particulate haze like phantoms of a lost reality. But survival instincts honed across millions of years of predatory evolution do not yield easily to environmental catastrophe. The veteran emerges from its rocky shelter, driven by needs that transcend the immediate dangers of toxic air and treacherous footing. Hunger, thirst, and the territorial imperatives that have guided its behavior throughout its adult life demand action even when rational assessment suggests that action may prove futile. This is the final test of apex predator adaptation, the ability to continue functioning when all environmental parameters have shifted beyond the range of previous experience. The hunt that follows represents both heroic determination and tragic futility. The veteran moves through the ash-covered landscape with persistent purpose, its powerful stride creating clouds of gray dust that swirl in its wake like the contrails of approaching doom. Each step requires additional energy to break through accumulated debris, while the reduced visibility makes prey detection nearly impossible, even for senses as acute as those evolution has provided its ultimate predator. The Triceratops herd, when finally located, presents a scene that captures the full tragedy of ecosystem collapse. The great herbivores huddle together in a defensive formation that has nothing to do with predator avoidance and everything to do with shared misery. In the face of environmental conditions, their species cannot survive. Their massive forms, normally gleaming with health and vigor, are dulled by ash coating and the visible effects of respiratory distress. Several individuals show clear signs of system failure: labored breathing, discharge from nostrils and eyes, and the unsteady posture that indicates neurological damage from toxin exposure. The veteran's approach triggers none of the usual defensive responses that would normally greet the arrival of an apex predator. The Triceratops are too weakened by environmental stress to mount effective resistance, too focused on their own survival to spare energy for territorial defense. This should represent the easiest hunting opportunity in the veteran's memory, but the reality proves more complex and ultimately more tragic than simple predation. The attack, when it comes, lacks the explosive power and tactical precision that have characterized the veteran's hunting throughout its adult life. The accumulated effects of poor air quality, reduced nutrition, and constant environmental stress have begun to compromise even its formidable capabilities. The bone-crushing bite that once guaranteed instant kills now requires multiple attempts to achieve lethal results, while the speed and agility that made escape impossible for prey animals have been reduced to labored movements through increasingly difficult terrain. The selected target, an adult Triceratops weakened by days of environmental exposure, offers minimal resistance to the attack. Its famous defensive capabilities, the 3 horns and massive frill that have made its species legendary for their ability to drive off even Tyrannosaur attacks, hang uselessly as respiratory failure and toxin exposure prevent effective defensive responses. The kill, when finally achieved, feels less like successful predation than like a mercy granted to a suffering creature. But this final hunt carries consequences that extend beyond simple nutrition. The effort required to bring down even a weakened prey animal has depleted the veteran's remaining energy reserves to dangerously low levels. The toxic environment that poisoned the Triceratops will now poison its predator through consumption of contaminated meat. The veteran feeds because survival demands consumption, but each bite carries a cumulative toxin load that adds to the chemical burden already compromising its physiological systems. As the feeding concludes and the veteran seeks shelter from the continuing ashfall, the full scope of its situation becomes inescapably clear. This is not a temporary environmental disruption that can be survived through behavioral adaptation and tactical flexibility. The volcanic winter that has begun to grip Laramidia represents a fundamental shift in planetary conditions that will persist for years or decades, far beyond the survival capacity of large apex predators dependent on abundant prey and stable ecosystems. The veteran's final hours unfold with the dignity that has characterized its decades of successful predation. As respiratory failure and toxin exposure combine to shut down the physiological systems that have sustained 9 tons of predatory perfection, its massive form settles into the mud beside the river that has defined its territory since young adulthood. The ash continues to fall, gradually covering the greatest terrestrial predator in Earth's history with the gray shroud that will preserve its bones for paleontologists to discover 68 million years in the future. In those final moments, as consciousness fades and the great heart that has powered a lifetime of apex predation beats its last, the veteran Tyrannosaur embodies both the triumph and tragedy of evolutionary perfection. Its crown of teeth, designed by millions of years of natural selection to crush bone and dominate ecosystems, has proved helpless against forces operating on geological timescales. The individual excellence that made it the ultimate expression of predatory adaptation cannot transcend the planetary catastrophe that will reset the evolutionary clock and make way for new lineages to claim dominion over a transformed Earth. The body settles into the muddy riverbank as the current shifts and sediment begins to accumulate around the massive skeleton. Water levels rising from the continuing rainfall start the process of burial that will protect these bones from scavengers and weathering, creating the conditions necessary for exceptional preservation. Within hours, the first layers of protective sediment begin to cover the skull with its impressive array of fossil teeth, starting the fossilization process that will transform organic bone into stone. Days pass, then weeks, as the ashfall finally begins to diminish and the immediate crisis of volcanic winter gives way to the longer-term catastrophe of global climate change. The veteran's burial site accumulates layer upon layer of sediment, each stratum recording the environmental conditions of a world struggling to maintain ecological stability in the face of unprecedented disruption. The great predator's bones, protected by an accelerating burial process, begin their transformation from living calcium phosphate to mineralized fossil. The river system that claimed the veteran's final resting place continues its ancient work of moving sediment and reshaping landscapes, but now under conditions that will persist until the very end of the Cretaceous period. Flood cycles driven by altered weather patterns bury the Tyrannosaur skeleton under meters of protective mud and sand, creating the rapid burial conditions that produce exceptional fossil preservation. Within the growing sedimentary tomb, the chemistry of fossilization begins to replace original bone material with minerals that will preserve not just the shape, but many of the internal structures that will fascinate future paleontologists. Months accumulate into years as the environmental catastrophe that began with increased volcanic activity builds toward its ultimate climax. The asteroid impact that will mark the final end of the age of dinosaurs remains decades in the future, but the foundations for mass extinction have already been laid by the ecological disruptions that claimed individual lives like that of the veteran Tyrannosaur. Its bones rest in their sedimentary grave, accumulating the protective overburden that will shield them from the cosmic catastrophe to come. The Hell Creek Formation grows around the veteran's skeleton, each layer a chapter in the story of late Cretaceous environmental collapse. Future paleontologists will read this story in the changing chemistry of sedimentary rocks, in the gradual disappearance of dinosaur species from the fossil record, and in the exceptional preservation of individual specimens like the veteran that bear witness to the final moments of their kind's dominion over the Earth. When the asteroid finally arrives 66 million years ago, the veteran has already been buried beneath protective layers of sediment for generations. The cosmic impact that ends the age of dinosaurs adds final chapters to the geological story, but cannot reach the fossilized remains that have already achieved the immortality of stone. The great predator's crown of teeth, preserved in miraculous detail, awaits discovery by creatures that evolution has not yet begun to imagine. 68 million years later, when human paleontologists carefully excavate the Hell Creek Formation, they will uncover more than just fossilized bones. they will find preserved in stone the final testimony of apex predation, perfected over millions of years of evolution, then swept away by forces beyond any individual creature's ability to resist. The veteran's skeleton will join the ranks of museum specimens that teach future generations about the power and fragility of life on Earth, demonstrating both the remarkable achievements of natural selection and the ultimate vulnerability of even the most successful species to planetary catastrophe. The crown of teeth that gave the ancient predator its power will become humanity's window into a lost world, each fossilized fang a testament to evolutionary excellence and environmental tragedy combined. In the precision of their serrated edges and the massive roots that anchored them in living bone, these teeth preserve the story of adaptation pushed to its limits and finally overcome by changes operating on scales that individual experience cannot comprehend. Thus ends the reign of the tyrant Lizard King, not in battle with rivals or the failure of predatory skills, but in the patient accumulation of sediments that transform bone into stone and preserve for geological ages the evidence of life's greatest predatory achievement. The veteran's legacy lies not in offspring that will never exist or territory that will be reclaimed by continental drift, but in the fossilized testimony that evolution can produce magnificent predators that rule their world completely, until their world itself ceases to exist. In the final accounting, the veteran Tyrannosaur achieved what every apex predator seeks: complete dominance over its environment during its lifetime, successful competition with all rivals, and the respect accorded to supreme predatory capability. That such achievement proved temporary in the face of cosmic forces reflects no failure of adaptation or inadequacy of design, but rather the fundamental truth that individual excellence, however remarkable, cannot transcend the larger forces that shape planetary history. The crown of teeth rests in stone, awaiting discovery by minds capable of reading the story preserved in fossil bone. When found, they will tell of strength and intelligence, of successful predation and territorial dominance, of environmental catastrophe, and the patient processes that preserve some fragments of lost worlds for the instruction of distant futures. In the end, this may represent the closest approach to immortality that any predator, no matter how successful, can achieve. Transformation from living tissue into lasting stone that carries the memory of ancient power across the gulf of geological time.